Believe me, if I started murdering people, there'd be none of you left.
This is my story about how I met my psychopathic husband 4 years ago. I married the sweetest and most charming man in the world, and I believed I was the happiest woman alive. But I had no idea that a horrifying nightmare lay hidden behind that happiness. In the beginning, after the wedding, everything was perfect and we shared beautiful days together. Then, one morning, I woke up with a strange sensation, trying to open my eyes. But I couldn't. I woke up screaming, realizing there was something sticky covering my eyes, nose, and mouth. Through the blur, I could vaguely see my husband smiling, holding something in front of me. I yelled in shock, "What are you doing?" He calmly said, "Honey, I was putting some honey on your face to make your skin glow." Terrified, I pushed him away and stumbled outside. My face was covered in honey, which had gotten into my eyes, nose, and mouth, making it impossible to see or breathe properly. He yelled, "Let's have breakfast," and grabbed a piece of bread, shoving it into my mouth. I choked, gasping for air, but he kept forcing bread into my mouth, preventing me from speaking. Moments later, everything went dark. When I came to, I was in a hospital bed, my husband beside me, his shoulders shaking. It looked like he was crying, but to my horror, he was laughing. I struggled to grasp reality, wondering why I was in the hospital. He leaned in and said, "If you pass out, I can't play with you anymore, honey. Next time, let me know if you feel like fainting, and I'll give you a break." My heart pounded as I realized what was happening. I screamed at him in rage, "Why are you acting like a psycho?" He paused briefly and then said, "I've been waiting for this moment for the past 2 years." His face twisted with a sinister excitement. My shock turned to tears. I shouted that I was calling the police. His face darkened and he snapped, "Shut up! Do you know how happy I am right now? Don't ruin it." He grabbed my hands, pinning me down, and held me in that hospital room the entire day. Then, in a soft whisper, he said, "I've been thinking of ways to have fun with you every day. Thanks for marrying me. Now I can play with you all I want." I sobbed. "Why? Why are you doing this?" He chuckled and licked my tears. In a chilling whisper, he said, "You were always smiling." I hated it. "From now on, I'll make you live a life full of tears. Your sadness is the sweetest thing to me." He laughed maniacally. Gathering my strength, I spat in his face, and while he wiped it off, I bolted from the room. I ran straight to the police station, begging them to protect me. I filed for divorce immediately. Thankfully, I managed to escape and slowly rebuild my life. Not long after, he sent me a final text. "It's a pity. I still had so much to do with you." I later found out something chilling. He had been married and divorced 4 times before me. All 4 of his ex-wives had died by suicide. That's when I understood. He wasn't looking for a wife, he was searching for a toy to torment. I went through years of psychiatric therapy to heal. I'll never forget the last day I saw him. He pulled a Barbie doll from his pocket, a string tied around its neck. He lifted the string, letting the doll hang, and said, "It's a pity. I wanted you to end up like this." I slammed the door behind me and never looked back. That experience taught me a bitter truth. Humans can be more terrifying than devils. And there are monsters wearing human faces walking among us every day. Ha ha ha. My name is Jessica. I'm just a regular woman with a husband and 2 kids. I met my husband at the high school we both attended, and we got married right after graduation. I became pregnant soon after and had to undergo a cesarean section during delivery. Thankfully, both the babies and I were healthy. We were living a happy life, until something terrifying happened a few days ago. Emma, one of my best friends since high school, lost her mind. I had always known Emma as a sweet, shy, and quiet girl. A few weeks ago, we attended our school reunion. I saw my classmates again for the first time in about 12 years since graduation. Everything was going well, and we were enjoying ourselves. But then Emma arrived. She looked like she hadn't slept in weeks. and there was a terrible smell coming from her. Everyone froze in shock as she entered the room. Suddenly, Emma pulled a knife from her pocket. Everyone screamed, and she shouted, "Jessica, you'll pay for what you did to me!" Before she could get any closer, police officers burst through the large sliding glass door and tackled her to the ground. She growled like a feral animal as they restrained her. The police explained that she had escaped from a mental asylum just hours earlier. I was in disbelief, wondering what had happened to her. I felt sorry for Emma. She had changed so drastically. A few days later, I received a call from an unknown number. An older woman on the line introduced herself as a nurse from the local mental asylum. She said she needed to talk to me about Emma. I had nothing planned that day, so I decided to visit the asylum. When I arrived, the old nurse welcomed me and led me to a room separated by a glass window, like those in prisons. On the other side, there she was, Emma. She was strapped to a chair, mumbling to herself. The nurse entered the room and gently said, "He's here, sweetie." Emma slowly raised her head, her eyes wild, bloodshot, and full of rage. She screamed, "They're mine! You stole them! You must suffer for it!" I was frozen, completely confused. What was she talking about? The nurse came back to my side and asked, "Jessica, you have a husband and 2 children, right?" I nodded, my heart beginning to race. She sighed and whispered, "I have to tell you something. One of them isn't yours." My stomach dropped. She continued, "You said you had a cesarean section, but part of your memory isn't real. One of your sons is actually Emma's. To be specific, he is Emma and your husband's child." She explained that when Emma gave birth, she had a mental breakdown and threw her baby to the floor. The hospital staff immediately realized she wasn't stable, which is why she was committed to the asylum that same day. After that, your husband took the baby and tricked you into believing both children were yours. When Emma realized her child was gone, she escaped the asylum and came to the reunion. I stood there, paralyzed, staring at Emma's hollow eyes. My husband had always seemed so kind, but now I knew the awful truth. He had lied to me and betrayed me with my former best friend. I went home in a daze. Since then, I haven't told anyone. More accurately, I can't. My children still believe I'm their real mother. If I confront my husband, our entire family will fall apart. What should I do? I have never had the best of luck with guys. I seem to have a knack for making poor choices when it comes to dating. After separating for good from my daughter's father after 5 years together, I decided it was time to just focus on myself. About 3 months into being a single mother, my neighbor approached me saying that a friend of his, Mike, wanted to meet me. It didn't take long before Mike charmed his way into my life. The first 6 months were wonderful, but then he started drinking more and more, and each time he did, he'd get extremely agitated. He'd start fights with random people, and even some of our mutual friends. Slowly, our friends stopped coming around because they knew how Mike acted when he drank. This didn't stop Mike from drinking, but now all of his anger was aimed at me. It took roughly 6 to 8 months for the abuse to escalate from name-calling and shoving to punching and choking. One time, I escaped through the bathroom window. He found me later by beating up one of my friends until they told him where I was hiding. In a drunken rage, Mike stripped all of my clothes off, laughing and daring me to try escaping while I was naked. The last night of abuse was by far the worst. Before Mike started drinking that night, I told him that my son, who was 3 years old, wasn't feeling well. I planned to stay with my son until he fell asleep, hoping to spend the night by his side. At around 2:30 in the morning, I heard the bedroom door creak open. I lay there pretending to be asleep, tears pooling in my eyes as I held my breath. Suddenly, I felt his hand grab a fistful of my hair and yank me out of bed. He whispered angrily in my ear, "I know you're avoiding me." Once in the living room, he threw me onto the floor, accusing me of planning to leave him and demanding to know why. Before I could answer, he came to his own conclusion. It had to be because of another man. "I swear to God, if I catch you with someone else, I'll kill you both," he threatened. He was more drunk than usual, He punched and kicked me, knocking me to the ground. As I tried crawling towards my son's room, he stepped in front of me and sneered, "Where do you think you're going?" He kneeled down and hissed, "You stay right there, or I'll hurt you real bad." Then he sat on the couch watching me sob on the floor. After about 30 minutes, he seemed to pass out. I saw my chance to escape. I slipped on an oversized shirt, picked up my son, and crept towards the door. Just as I thought we'd made it, Mike woke up and grabbed my leg. "Where are you going?" he slurred. I stammered, "I'm just getting a drink for my son." "Hurry up," he snapped, releasing his grip. The moment I stepped into the kitchen, I bolted out the front door, barefoot with no pants, no shoes, and no purse. I carried my son all the way to the police station, which thankfully was only a few blocks away. After hours, the police station required you to enter a room, press a button, and speak to someone through an intercom. I ran in, backed against the wall, and pressed the button behind me as I slid to the floor, clutching my son, waiting for Mike to burst through the door at any second. I thought to myself, if I'm going to be beaten, at least it'll be on camera. Through the intercom, a voice asked, "How can I help you?" All I could do was cry. I couldn't get a single word out. 2 officers came out to help me. A female officer took my son and gave him something to eat, while a male officer wrapped me in a blanket and took my statement. 15 minutes later, I heard Mike screaming my name as they dragged him down the hallway. I held my breath, terrified he'd know I was behind the door. 30 minutes later, an officer returned with a sergeant. My heart sank, thinking they'd send me home to gather my things while Mike was in custody. Instead, they asked more questions about his anger and if he'd been violent before. I explained Mike's drinking problem and the escalating abuse. Then they showed me a list, written in Mike's handwriting. It detailed how he planned to dismember my body and bury me where no one would find me. There were dates listed, past dates crossed out. I couldn't breathe. Tears streamed down my face. "What does this mean?" I whispered. The officer looked at me and said, "It means you're lucky." Mike was charged with attempted murder, kidnapping, and assault. I left for Nevada before the trial, giving a detailed statement before I left. Mike pled not guilty, but he was sentenced to 2 years in prison. Just before I left, I received a letter from him. It simply read, "It's not over. You'll always be mine." It was 18 years ago when I was 12 years old. I used to live with my uncle, who was 32 at the time. He convinced my family that I'd have a better life if I stayed with him in his farmhouse. On the surface, it looked like a peaceful place, but it was all a lie. My uncle had a big van that he used to abduct children. He usually targeted kids who were lost or playing in parks. He wasn't just a kidnapper, he was a cold-blooded murderer. When he kidnapped the children, he'd tie them up and order me to dig a hole for each one. I was terrified of him, but I didn't dare refuse. One day, I stayed in the basement with the kidnapped children to watch over them. They cried and begged me to let them go. Some of them were close to my age and I couldn't take it anymore. I untied them and helped them escape through the back door, making sure my uncle didn't see. He was in the kitchen, sharpening his knives. I went back to the kitchen and pretended everything was normal, but when he glanced up, he saw the kids running through the window. He exploded in rage, grabbed his gun and ran out the door, trying to shoot them. I followed, hoping and praying they would get away. Luckily, they did. One of the kids even turned back and waved at me, a small sign of hope. My uncle seemed to think I was upset about their escape. The next morning, he was gone when I woke up. Then I heard sirens blaring. Moments later, the police burst into the farmhouse. They found me and asked if I was one of the kidnapped kids. I couldn't lie. I felt deep guilt for the children who suffered at my uncle's hands, so I told the police the truth, that I was his nephew. I broke down in tears as I confessed his crimes. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done because, despite everything, I still loved him. But I knew this moment would come. I had been waiting for it. At first, the police didn't believe me. but I showed them where the bodies were buried. As they dug up the evidence, the horrible truth came to light. Meanwhile, my uncle had gone to my mother's house. He hugged her and begged to stay for a while, but the police had already informed her of what had happened. She let him in, and as soon as he went to take a shower, she called my dad, and they alerted the police. My uncle was arrested that day. The police praised me, calling me a brave kid. They took me back to my parents, where I could finally live a better life. My uncle was charged with kidnapping, murder, and exposing me to things no child should ever see. He was sentenced to death and not long after was finally hanged. The story is about my mom's recent ex-husband. It happened over the last few years, and even now, she still doesn't fully admit how bad the situation really was. I think she's still in denial about it. She met this guy, who I'll call Mark, when I was 6 years old. At that time, we had just moved to Tennessee, and she was still with my dad. Not long after, they split up, and my mom started dating Mark. We moved to Texas to live with my grandparents for a few years, but she and Mark kept talking the entire time. Fast forward a few years, and I was around 15. I also have a younger sister who's 6 years younger than me. She was deeply affected by everything that happened since she had to witness it firsthand. Anyway, a few years later, Mark and my mom started dating seriously again and decided to get married. I always had a bad feeling about him, and I tried to warn my mom, but she didn't listen. Mark was a smoker, which my mom hated, and he used to have a drinking problem. She didn't realize how bad it was until after they got married. I went to stay with my older cousin for a few months for personal reasons I'd rather not discuss. During that time, my mom and Mark got married. When I returned home, Mark was living with us. We lived in a small 2-bedroom house, and my sister and I shared a room. But my sister often slept in my mom's room because she was afraid of the dark, which meant she was sleeping in the same room as Mark too. Now, here's where things got messy. Mark started drinking again. He was constantly drunk and would steal money from my mom to buy beer. She tried to get him into rehab a few times, but it never worked. When he finally got another job after being fired from his previous one, he would hide his money and refuse to help with the bills. Since they were married, it made sense for them to share the financial responsibilities, but Mark didn't care. My mom and Mark fought almost every night about money, his drinking, him sneaking off to buy beer, and stealing. It was awful to hear, and I felt terrible for my sister having to go through it too. Mark would hide his car keys to keep things in his car. One time, my mom found weed in there. He even stole money from my little sister for whatever he needed. He insisted on buying the most expensive gas for his car, which meant he needed hundreds of dollars from my mom each month just for that. After he lost his first job, he sold his gun. My mom believes that if he still had that gun, he would have gone after his boss. My mom kicked him out several times, but she always took him back, even though my sister and I begged her not to. At one point, he tried to bribe us with Apple Watches, but it didn't change how we felt about him. One night, he was drunk in bed, saying he was going to kill himself. My mom told me to call 911. My sister was in the room while everything happened. Mark had even cheated on my mom during one of the times she kicked him out. After a couple of years, my mom finally kicked him out for good. He went back to the woman he cheated with. That's when the calls, emails, texts, and threats began. They would call and text us, blaming my mom for everything and spreading lies about her. He was always drunk when he called. Once, his new girlfriend even threatened to slit my mom's throat. That was the final straw. We called the cops, but they couldn't really do anything to stop the harassment. The calls and texts kept coming. My mom continued receiving emails until just a few months ago. I'm 18 years old now, and my sister and I are still traumatized. It felt like my mom chose him over us, and that still hurts. I just hope I never see Mark again.